I know you're watching this video to fall asleep. That's great. Why not take a moment to comment on the time you're watching and where you're from? And before you drift off, don't forget to subscribe so you can enjoy more videos like this every night. Sweet Dreams. Story 1. The Whispers in Blackwood Forest. Ethan had always loved camping alone. The silence of the forest, the cool night air, the crackling fire. It was his way of escaping the chaos of everyday life. This time, he chose Blackwood Forest, a remote stretch of wilderness known for its towering pines and endless, shadowy trails, a place untouched by time. The locals had warned him. They spoke of strange occurrences, of whispers in the dark, of campers who entered and never returned. But Ethan dismissed the stories as backwoods superstition. He had camped in countless forests before. What was there to fear? As night fell, he set up camp near a small clearing. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the trees, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. The air was crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of damp leaves. He felt at peace until he heard it, a whisper, faint, distant, carried by the wind. He froze, the hairs on his arms rising. The voice was too low to make out the words, but it was there, unmistakably human. Ethan turned, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just shadows swaying in the moonlight. His heart thudded against his ribs, but he shook it off. Probably just his imagination. The mind played tricks in the solitude of the wild. Then it came again. A whisper, a giggle. His chest tightened. He wasn't alone. The fire flickered violently as a gust of wind rushed through the clearing. He squinted into the dark, the flashlight beam trembling in his grip. Then he saw them, figures standing just beyond the tree line, dozens of them, motionless, watching. Their faces were pale, hollow, and their mouths moving, whispering. Ethan staggered backward, his breath caught in his throat. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the whispering only grew louder, overlapping, a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. Then they stepped forward, not walking, gliding. Their feet never touched the ground. Ethan grabbed his pack and ran, heart pounding, deeper into the forest. The whispering followed, growing louder and more desperate. He ran until his legs burned, until the whispers became screams. Then, silence. He turned. Nothing but trees. The figures were gone. Panting, he checked his phone. No signal. He had no choice but to wait out the night. But as he set up a new camp, something caught his eye. His own footprints in the dirt, leading right back to his abandoned campsite. And among them, another set of prints, following close behind. Still fresh, still wet, still not his. A sharp chill crawled up his spine. He backed away from the prints, scanning the darkness. The fire crackled weakly, casting fleeting shadows against the trees. Then, just beyond the glow, he saw something, a shape shifting between the trunks. It didn't move like a person. It slithered, its form barely solid, more shadow than flesh. Then came the whispers again, closer than before, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. Ethan. His name. The wind carried it in a dozen different voices, layered, distorted, slipping between the trees. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. This was a trick, an echo in the night, nothing more. Then something cold brushed against his neck. He spun around, but the air was empty. Ethan stumbled backward. He had to get out. Now he grabbed his pack and flashlight and took off in the direction he thought led back to the road. But the deeper he ran, the more the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching for him like skeletal fingers. The path was gone, swallowed by the shifting forest. His breath came in ragged gasps. He stopped to get his bearings, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whispering had stopped. But the forest was different now. The trees loomed taller, their bark blackened as if charred by unseen flames. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic. The moon, once bright and silver, was gone, replaced by a sickly red glow that barely illuminated the mist curling around his ankles. This was wrong. Somehow, the forest had changed. A rustling came from behind him, slow, deliberate. He turned. A figure stood there, its body barely visible through the mist. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its head tilted as if studying him. Its face was indistinct, shifting like ripples in water. Ethan took a step back. The thing moved too, mirroring him. Then it smiled, not with lips nor teeth, but with the shape of its ever-shifting face contorting into something that resembled a grin. And then it whispered, "Stay." Ethan bolted. His feet pounded the earth, his lungs burned, but the forest never ended. The trees blurred together, their branches clawing at the sky. The whispers returned, rising to a deafening cacophony, surrounding him. Then, without warning, the ground disappeared beneath him. He was falling. Darkness swallowed him whole. When Ethan awoke, the forest was still. Dawn had broken, pale sunlight filtering through the trees. He was lying on the damp earth, his body aching, his clothes torn and muddy. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? He pushed himself up and staggered forward. The trees no longer looked twisted. The air was no longer thick with whispers. In the distance, he saw a break in the trees, the road. Relief surged through him. He was safe, but then he saw them. At the edge of the forest, just before the clearing, they stood, dozens of them, watching, silent. Their faces were clearer now, pale, hollow, familiar. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew those faces. They were his, all of them. They smiled and whispered, "See you soon." The house in the fog. The road to Linden Manor had long been swallowed by time. No one in town spoke of it anymore, except in whispers. Tales of a house that never quite belonged to this world, standing shrouded in fog at the edge of the cliffs. Isla never believed in such stories. But when her late uncle's will named her the sole inheritor of the forgotten estate, she had no choice but to go. The house awaited, its silhouette barely visible through the creeping mist. The iron gates groaned as she pushed them open, revealing an overgrown garden where roses bloomed colorless in the moonlight. A strange stillness hung in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something sweeter, something floral, yet rotting. The walls were lined with oil paintings, their subjects staring with dark, knowing eyes. Dust clung to the antique furniture, yet the grand chandelier above still gleamed, its candles freshly burned. Someone had been here. She explored cautiously, trailing her fingers along the banister of the sweeping staircase. The house felt awake, watching, waiting. But for what? That night, Isla barely slept. The wind rattled the windows, the fog pressing against the glass like pale hands searching for a way inside. At some point, she must have drifted off, because she awoke to the sound of a woman weeping. Software distant, coming from the hallway. She sat up, heart pounding. A dream. The sound came again, drifting like mist beneath her door. Someone was there. Gathering her courage, Isla stepped into the hall, the wooden floor cold against her bare feet. The crying grew louder as she approached the old study, a room left locked when she arrived. But now, the door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The fire in the hearth had long since died, but the air was thick with the scent of burnt lavender. And there, in the center of the room, stood a woman in a flowing white gown, her back turned, her dark hair cascading down in damp, tangled waves. Isla opened her mouth to speak, but the woman turned first. Her face was blurred, shifting, as if seen through rippling water. And yet, her eyes, they were clear, piercing, filled with sorrow. A whisper drifted from her lips. A name. Beatrice. Then she was gone. The room was empty once more. The next morning, Isla found herself drawn to the house's library, determined to find some trace of this Beatrice. The shelves stretched high, dust gathering on forgotten tomes, but one book lay open on the grand oak desk. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with time. She hesitated before reading. March 12th, 1884. The fog grows thicker each night. I hear her outside my door, whispering my name, waiting to be let in. But if I let her in, I fear I will never leave this house again. March 14th, 1884. Beatrice is gone. They say she threw herself from the cliffs, that she was mad with grief, but I know the truth. She did not jump. She was taken. The final entry sent a shiver down Isla's spine. March 15th, 1884. If you are reading this, she has found you too. The air grew heavy, pressing against her skin, and then a breath at her ear. Isla. She spun around. The study door was open again, and inside, the fire burned once more. That night, Isla sat by candlelight, journal in hand. The storm outside had grown fierce, the wind howling through the corridors. She forced herself to stay awake, listening for the weeping woman. She did not have to wait long. The whispering began first, just outside her door. Then the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the wooden floorboards. She gripped the candle. Beatrice? The door creaked open. There she was, the woman in white, her blurred face trembling as she reached out a hand. Help me. A gust of wind extinguished the candle. Darkness swallowed the room. And then, cold fingers wrapped around Isla's wrist. She gasped, stumbling backward, but the grip was relentless, pulling, dragging. The walls warped, the floor stretched away beneath her feet, and suddenly, she was not in her room anymore. She was standing at the cliffs. The wind roared around her, the sea crashing against the jagged rocks below. And before her, Beatrice knelt at the edge, whispering to the mist. Please. Beatrice turned, her eyes now fully formed, fully real, full of fear. Do not let her take me. Isla stepped forward, but something else was already there. A shadow, towering and shapeless, rising from the mist itself. It reached for Beatrice, its fingers stretching like tendrils of smoke. Isla lunged, grabbing Beatrice's hand, but the shadow was stronger. A scream echoed through the night. And then, Beatrice was gone. The fog swallowed her whole. When Isla awoke, she was still clutching the journal, its pages damp with morning dew. She was outside, standing at the cliffs. The house loomed behind her, its windows dark, empty, as if no one had lived there in a very, very long time. But the whisper still lingered in the air, software faint, calling her name, the stillness of the lake. Sophie had always found peace in the quiet places, the ones that didn't demand anything from her. There was something about silence that called to her, something deeper than mere absence of sound. It was the stillness, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. That was why she came to the lake. It wasn't particularly beautiful. It wasn't especially remote, but it was quiet, utterly and profoundly quiet. The water shimmered like glass, its surface reflecting the sky in an almost unreal way, as though the earth had drawn a thin veil between this world and the next. She arrived at the lake just as the sun began to dip below the trees. The light seemed to turn liquid, soft and golden, pooling in the hollow of the valley where the lake sat. The air had a crispness to it, the kind that chilled the bones but never quite touched the skin. Sophie set up camp by the water's edge. The tent, a small, inconspicuous shape against the sweeping wilds. She didn't need much, just a fire, a blanket, and the sky overhead. As night came, the air deepened, The forest beyond the water became a silhouette, its dark shadows stretching impossibly long. She stared at the lake, mesmerized by the way the moonlight danced across the surface, casting ripples of silver across the stillness. The fire crackled softly, almost as if it were part of the dream. Her thoughts drifted, almost as if she were floating above herself, watching from some distant place, distant but not separate. That was when she first heard it. A sound, so faint that she wasn't sure it was real at all. A whisper, perhaps. The wind? No, the trees were too still. There was no rustling of leaves, no whisper of branches, but the sound persisted, a quiet hum, like a faraway song caught in the breath of the night. It made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, and she turned, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the firelight. But the camp was empty. Only the lake, the fire, and the dark shadows of trees. She shrugged and went back to the warmth of the fire, trying to ignore the odd feeling that had taken root in her chest. The hum grew louder, but it wasn't a song anymore. It was more like a voice, far off, pulling her toward it. She stood up, drawn to the water's edge, her feet soft against the cool earth. Something in her chest tugged gently, pulling her into the darkened world where sound and shadow mingled. The lake, the trees, the stars, they all seemed to hum together in harmony, as if everything were connected by an invisible thread. Her feet barely made a sound on the ground, and she felt as though she were moving in a dream. The water's edge was closer now, the air thick with the smell of moss and earth. The lake's surface was impossibly still, reflecting the sky above, as if it were one seamless thing. Sky, earth, and water all wrapped into one. Sophie's heart beat in time with the rhythm of the lake, and her breath slowed to match its stillness. The whisper was now so clear it was almost a voice, though it wasn't speaking words she could understand. She could feel the words, as though they were something ancient and familiar, like a half-forgotten memory. She stepped closer to the water, her feet slipping into the soft, damp earth. The lake stretched out before her, vast and unbroken. As she gazed into its depths, something shifted in the water. A ripple just beneath the surface, not caused by wind or any visible disturbance. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Sophie felt it deep inside her, a vibration that sent a shiver through her spine. Without thinking, she stepped into the water. The cold bit at her toes, but she continued, letting the cool water climb up her legs until it reached her waist. The hum grew louder now, almost pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of her heart. She didn't stop, didn't question why she was moving deeper into the lake, deeper into the unknown. The water seemed to pull her, beckoning her further. Sophie was no longer sure whether she was walking or floating, but it didn't matter. The water surrounded her, enveloping her like a lover's embrace, soothing, constant. Then, as she let the water reach her chest, the whispers became a voice. Clearer now, it wasn't speaking to her, but through her. It wasn't a language she knew, but something within her understood. "Sophie," the voice breathed, like a dream remembered too late. "Come closer." Her body swayed as though the water itself were pulling her deeper, and she let it. She didn't fight the current, didn't feel the cold or the deepening weight of the water around her. Her feet no longer touched the ground, and she drifted, weightless. The water was warm now, gently pressing against her skin, soothing her and cradling her. Sophie felt a peace settle over her, a peace so complete, it erased every concern and every fear. The hum of the lake, the whispers of the trees, the soft swaying of the earth, all of it was one thing, one rhythm, one perfect flow. As she let the water rise higher, covering her throat, she felt her body grow lighter. The fire on the shore, the stars overhead, even the sound of the water seemed to dim and blur, fading into something beyond time. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time she felt as though she was no longer separate. She was part of the lake, part of the night, part of everything. The lake whispered, and Sophie listened. When the morning sun broke through the trees, it illuminated the stillness of the lake. The water was calm and serene, no ripples, no movement. Sophie was gone. There was only the soft hum, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. No one found her, no one saw her leave. But if you stand on the shore, just before the sun sets, and listen closely, you can still hear the hum. If you close your eyes and let the rhythm of the lake fill your chest, you'll hear her, just for a moment, calling your name. The Silent Watcher. Nestled on the outskirts of a peaceful town, a charming little house sat at the end of a winding dirt road, its stone walls covered in ivy, with a garden full of wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. To many, it seemed like the perfect escape, quiet, serene, and tucked away from the busy world. It was exactly what Emma and James had been searching for, the ideal place to begin their new life together. Far from the noise and chaos of the city, they had dreamed of a home like this for years. The moment they stepped inside, they were enchanted. The house was cozy, with soft wooden beams across the ceiling, and an old-fashioned fireplace crackling with warmth. The large windows let in streams of golden sunlight during the day, and the evenings brought a peaceful calm, the perfect backdrop for their fresh start. Every corner of the house seemed to speak of history, yet it felt alive with possibility, a place where they could make new memories together. However, it didn't take long for them to notice something unusual. In the living room, directly across from the fireplace, hung an old portrait of a woman. The frame was simple, slightly weathered, but the woman in the painting was striking. Her face, soft and serene, was the type of portrait one might expect in an old family home. She wore a high-necked dress with lace, her brown hair neatly styled in gentle waves. Her expression was calm, almost wistful, but what struck them both was her eyes, those dark, deep eyes that seemed to follow anyone who stepped into the room. No matter where they stood, it felt as though the woman was watching them, her gaze unwavering, silently observing. At first, Emma and James laughed it off. It was a strange coincidence, they reasoned. Just a trick of the light, maybe, or the way the house settled. But the longer they lived there, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the eyes, it was the feeling of being watched, a subtle but constant presence in the room. It was as if the walls themselves held a memory, a story that was trying to be remembered, though no one could quite place what it was. At night, they would settle into bed, the house silent and still, and yet, there was always something. Footsteps. Soft, faint footsteps that echoed down the hallway as though someone was walking past their bedroom door. Sometimes it sounded like a gentle tap, 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 almost like the softest knock on the door. But when they got up to check, the hallway would be empty. The sound would stop as mysteriously as it had begun, and everything would return to quiet. They never spoke of the footsteps out loud. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared feeling that they didn't want to acknowledge. It was unsettling, yes, but not enough to make them question their decision to live here. After all, the house was their dream home, and they didn't want to ruin it with needless worry. They told themselves it was just the house settling, the old floors creaking, and the wind brushing against the windows. But as the days passed, they noticed more strange occurrences. The temperature in the house seemed to shift at random, sometimes growing unexpectedly warm, other times chillingly cold, like the air itself was alive with a strange energy. Emma would walk into the living room in the morning to find the portrait ever so slightly turned, as if it had been moved during the night, though no one had touched it. And sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, they would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of their eyes, an indistinct figure standing by the window, only to vanish when they turned to look. One evening, after a particularly strange incident where Emma had heard soft humming echoing from the living room, James decided he'd had enough. He was determined to uncover the mystery behind the woman in the portrait. So, he carefully took the painting off the wall, hoping to find some clue that would explain the strange occurrences. To his surprise, behind the frame, he found a letter, yellowed with age, its ink faded, but still legible. It was folded carefully, as if someone had placed it there long ago with the intent of leaving a message for someone to find. He carefully unfolded it, and the words began to reveal themselves. The letter was a warning. It spoke of a guardian spirit, a protector who had lived in the house long before Emma and James had arrived. The spirit, the letter said, had been a woman who had once lived in the house, someone who had loved it deeply and had vowed to protect it after her passing. It was said that her presence remained in the home, silently watching over it, ensuring that those who lived there were safe from harm. The footsteps, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, it was all her doing. The woman had no intention of frightening the occupants of the house. Rather, she was there to protect them. She would only reveal herself to those who were pure of heart, those who needed her protection. James sat down with the letter, his heart racing. He glanced at the portrait once more, now seeing the woman not as a mere painting, but as something much more profound. She wasn't just staring at him. She was watching over him, watching over both of them. The realization settled into his bones, a feeling of quiet comfort. They were not alone, but they were not in danger either. The house had a silent guardian. Over the next few weeks, Emma and James began to embrace the presence of the woman in the painting. The strange noises continued, but they no longer seemed unsettling. In fact, they found comfort in the soft hum of the house, as though it was a reminder that they were cared for, watched over. Emma even began to talk to the portrait in passing, almost as though she were speaking to an old friend. And when the footsteps echoed down the hallway at night, they no longer felt eerie. Instead, it was like a quiet reminder that the house was alive, that there was someone with them, keeping watch. The house, once quiet and full of mystery, began to feel like home in a way it never had before. Emma would often sit by the fire, reading a book, and feel a sense of peace she had never known. James, too, found himself sleeping more soundly, comforted by the feeling that the silent watcher was nearby, a guardian of sorts who had always been there, waiting. One evening, as Emma sat by the fireplace, she noticed something new. The portrait of the woman, for the first time, seemed to have a soft, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. It was as though she was pleased with how things had turned out, glad that she had found her new family. Emma smiled back, silently thanking her for her quiet watchfulness. In that moment, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt warm, as though it had embraced them as its own. As the years passed, Emma and James continued to live in the house, their love growing alongside the memories they made there. And though the footsteps still echoed through the halls at night, they never felt afraid. The silent watcher was there, and they had come to trust her. In the stillness of the night, with the soft hum of the house around them, they knew that they were safe, not just from danger, but from loneliness too. They had found a home, not just in each other, but in the presence of a spirit who had been there long before them, watching over the house and keeping it, and them, safe.
Whispers in the moonlight. In a small, peaceful village far from the bustling world, surrounded by green hills and wild forests, there stood a cabin that seemed almost woven into the landscape, as though it had always been there. The air was thick with tranquility, and the quiet whispers of the wind were the loudest sounds one could hear on most days. It was in this serene place that Ella found herself one cool autumn evening, stepping out of a car that had carried her from the city. She had come to this cabin, her grandmother's home, to escape the hurried pace of her life and to find a sense of peace she had long been searching for. Her grandmother had passed away earlier that year, leaving the cabin to Ella in her will. It was a gift, but also a responsibility, one that Ella had not fully understood until now. She had visited the cabin only a few times as a child, but the memory of her grandmother's warmth, her kind eyes, and the comforting smell of herbal tea and fresh-baked bread lingered in her mind. Now, the cabin stood quiet and still, as if waiting for Ella to return to it, to begin the next chapter of its story. Ella spent the first few days getting settled. The simple rustic furniture still held a sense of familiarity, and the wooden floors creaked in a comforting way underfoot. The tall windows allowed soft streams of sunlight to pour in, casting gentle patterns on the floor. At night, the sky above was a blanket of stars, so clear and bright that it felt as if one could almost reach up and touch them. However, as the days turned into nights, something peculiar began to happen. It was subtle at first, just a soft murmur in the distance, barely more than a whisper. Ella would hear it late at night when the world outside was still, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The voice seemed to call her name, faint and distant, but unmistakable. At first, Ella thought it was just her imagination, tired from the stresses of the past weeks, but night after night, it grew louder, clearer, as though the wind itself was trying to speak to her. Ella. Ella, the voice would say, always carried on the wind, just beyond her reach. At first she ignored it, convincing herself that the sound was simply the wind rustling the trees, or perhaps an animal making its way through the woods. But the whispers continued, growing in strength until, one evening, she could no longer dismiss them. Curious and a little uneasy, Ella stepped out onto the cabin's small porch. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth surrounding her, and the full moon shone brightly in the sky, casting a soft, silvery light across the landscape. The village was quiet, tucked away in peaceful slumber, but the whispers, the soft, insistent whispers, seemed to come from the woods that stretched beyond the cabin, their voices calling her name, pulling her toward the forest. Something deep within her stirred, a sense of both calm and curiosity. She didn't know why, but she felt an urge to follow the whispers, to see where they led. With a steady breath, Ella made her way down the path that led to the forest. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze, as though they were beckoning her forward. The whispers seemed to grow louder with every step she took, filling the air like a soft melody, carrying the names of those who had come before her. As she walked deeper into the forest, the moonlight began to filter through the branches, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air was cool, but not cold. The earth beneath her feet soft and damp. It was peaceful, eerily peaceful. And then, as she ventured further, she came upon something that took her breath away. There, in the center of the forest, stood an ancient oak tree. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, its branches stretching high into the sky, twisting in intricate patterns. The tree seemed to pulse with an energy that Ella could feel deep within her chest. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced before, like the tree itself was alive, watching, waiting. And it was under this oak tree that the whispers grew quiet, as if holding their breath. Ella se detuvo, su corazón latiendo, pero no se sentía asustada. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as though everything in the world had come to rest in this one moment. As she stood beneath the tree, a soft voice, familiar yet distant, spoke to her. carrying a sense of both comfort and purpose. It was her grandmother's voice, clear and soothing. "Ella," the voice whispered, "you are here because it is time. It is your turn now." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She felt a strange connection to the tree, as though it were rooted deep within her own soul. It was then that she noticed something else. Etched into the bark of the tree were symbols, faded with age, but still visible. They looked like ancient runes, intricate and mysterious.
The whispers, once soft and distant, now seemed to surround her, their voices gentle, but insistent. They weren't just whispers, they were the voices of the protectors of the village, those who had kept it safe from unseen dangers for generations. Her grandmother had been one of them, and now it was her turn to carry on the tradition. The tree, the forest, and the whispers were all part of a long-forgotten ritual, one that her grandmother had performed every night to ensure the safety of the village. Ella stood still, listening intently to the voices around her, the weight of the responsibility settling over her like a gentle embrace. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she understood. The ritual had always been a quiet, hidden part of the village's history. It was a duty passed down through generations, always carried out in silence, beneath the full moon, under the protection of the ancient oak tree. As the whispers continued, Ella realized that her grandmother had never truly left. She had always been a part of this place, of the earth, the trees, the wind, and the moon. And now, Ella was a part of it too. She wasn't just inheriting the cabin, she was inheriting the responsibility of watching over the village, of protecting it from the unseen forces that lingered just beyond the edge of the world. The realization was both comforting and humbling. Ella didn't need to fear the whispers anymore. They weren't voices of danger or warning. They were the voices of those who had come before her, guiding her, urging her to take her place in the circle of protection. As the night wore on, Ella sat beneath the ancient oak tree, the moonlight casting its soft glow on her face. She felt the weight of the responsibility, but she also felt a deep sense of peace. The village was safe, the earth was at rest, and she, Ella, was now a part of it all, a keeper of the secrets, a protector of the land, and a listener to the whispers in the moonlight. When the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Ella made her way back to the cabin, her heart full of calm and understanding. The whispers had faded, but their presence remained in the quiet hum of the world around her. The forest was peaceful once more, the wind carrying the soft scent of pine and earth. Ella knew now that she was never truly alone. The voices would always be there, guiding her through the quiet nights, just as they had for generations before her. And under the watchful eyes of the ancient oak, she would continue the ritual, keeping the village safe from harm, her heart at peace as the moonlight whispered its quiet lullaby. And as she lay in bed that night, the soft rustling of the trees outside her window, the gentle whisper of the wind through the branches, lulled her into a deep, peaceful sleep. The whispers in the moonlight were no longer something to fear. They were a part of her, a connection to the past, and a promise of protection for the future. And with that, Ella drifted into a dreamless slumber, the world outside as peaceful and calm as it had always been.